The day started like any other. The sun was shining brightly over the peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was a warm afternoon, and a light breeze made the trees sway gently. A young black boy, about 16 years old, walked along the quiet sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had just finished school and was heading home, looking forward to a relaxing evening. He wasn't in any hurry, just walking at a steady pace, his thoughts focused on the homework he'd do later, and the TV shows he'd catch up on. Suddenly, two police officers, driving in a squad car, slowed down as they approached him. The car stopped right next to him, and both officers got out. The boy was confused. He didn't know why they had stopped him. They weren't there to help. That was clear from the way they stepped toward him, their hands resting on their belts, looking serious. The officers didn't even offer a friendly greeting. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stern face, looked the boy up and down, his gaze cold. "Hey, kid, what's in that bag?" he asked, his voice sharp. The boy blinked, taken aback. "It's just my books, sir," he answered politely. He had nothing to hide. The officer didn't seem to care about the answer. "Open it up. We need to see what you're carrying," the officer demanded, stepping closer. The boy felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't understand why they were stopping him. There were plenty of other people walking around, but they had chosen him. Was it because of the color of his skin? He tried to stay calm, thinking it would all be over quickly, but the officer was getting more insistent. "Sir, I'm just going home. I don't have anything illegal in my bag," the boy said, his voice steady, but with a hint of confusion. He didn't want to make things worse by getting upset. He had seen how tense situations like this could get, and he didn't want that. But the officer wasn't having it. He motioned to his partner, a younger officer with a buzz cut, to step forward. The younger officer didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the boy, as though trying to figure out if he was lying. The older officer moved in closer, his hands reaching toward the boy's backpack, and began unzipping it without asking for permission. The boy felt his heart race. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice now trembling a little. But the officers just ignored him, pulling out his books and checking through them one by one. There was nothing suspicious in the bag, just textbooks, a notebook, and a pencil case. But the officers didn't seem to care. They were focused on him, searching with more force than was necessary. The boy tried to remain still, not wanting to cause trouble. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why was he being treated like this? He had never done anything wrong. He had never been in trouble with the law. But here he was, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, feeling more and more frustrated by the second. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control. The two officers continued to search through the boy's backpack, pulling out his personal belongings and tossing them aside like they were worthless. The boy felt helpless as they went through his things, looking for something that wasn't there. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, his patience wearing thin. He had never been treated like this before. It was as though his word meant nothing to them. "Is this really necessary?" the boy asked, trying to stay calm. His voice was steady, but inside, his frustration was growing. The officer who had started the search didn't even look at him. He was focused on the bag, as if he expected to find something. But the more the officer searched, the more ridiculous it seemed. All the boy had were school books and notebooks. Nothing out of the ordinary. The younger officer, who hadn't said much up until now, took a few steps forward and stood beside his partner. He was watching the boy carefully, but there was no sign of sympathy or understanding in his eyes. The boy couldn't understand why they were treating him like this. He was just a kid trying to get home, just like anyone else. But instead of the officers seeing that, all they saw was someone to interrogate, someone to suspect. "Come on, what's the deal? Why are you holding me here?" the boy pressed, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing unease in his stomach. He knew he had to be careful, but the whole thing felt so unfair. The older officer ignored him, moving to the next item in his bag. The tension between them grew thicker with every passing second. The boy's mind was racing. He wasn't sure what to do. He had never been in this situation before, and he didn't want to make things worse. But the longer the officers kept him there, the more he realized this wasn't just an ordinary stop. This felt personal, and it felt wrong. "Just let me go. I'm not doing anything wrong," the boy said, his voice now a little sharper. The words hung in the air, but the officers didn't respond. They just continued with the search as though they were on a mission. The boy's body stiffened with every movement they made. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his hands beginning to shake slightly. He had to hold himself together. He couldn't let his frustration boil over into something worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer stepped back and zipped up the bag. The search was over, but the boy didn't feel any sense of relief. His head was spinning, and he couldn't stop thinking about how unfair the whole thing had been. He was just a teenager walking home. He didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his anger still bubbled just under the surface. He couldn't believe the way they had acted. If this was how the world saw him, just because of the color of his skin, then he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his cool. The officers, now realizing they had made a mistake, didn't seem to know what to do next. They were awkwardly shifting their weight from foot to foot, unsure of how to handle the situation. The boy, on the other hand, was feeling more and more powerless. He wanted to leave, but he didn't want to let them off the hook so easily. He had been wronged, and they needed to understand that. As the boy stood there, feeling a mix of confusion and anger, something changed in the air. The younger officer glanced down at the ID card the boy had pulled out earlier. He looked at it for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to make sense of something. The older officer, who had been focused on the bag just moments before, stopped his movements and looked at the card too. The boy could see the slight shift in their expressions. The tension between them started to break, but it wasn't the kind of relief the boy had hoped for. Instead, the air around them felt heavier. The officers exchanged a quick look, and the younger one seemed to recognize the boy's last name. He hesitated for a moment before turning to his partner, his voice almost inaudible as he muttered, "Isn't that?" The older officer didn't answer right away. He leaned in a bit closer, his eyes scanning the card, and then a look of realization crossed his face. He straightened up, his expression suddenly more serious, almost nervous. The boy watched this unfold in confusion. The officers had been acting so aggressively only moments ago, and now they were looking at him like they were seeing him for the first time. The younger officer, still uncertain, slowly took a step back and nervously muttered under his breath, You're his son, aren't you?" For a second, the boy didn't understand what the officer meant. His brow furrowed, and he glanced at the card in his hand. It was just his student ID, nothing special. But then it clicked. His father's name was on it. His father was a well-known figure in the community, someone who worked in a high position in the police department. The officers, clearly embarrassed, were now realizing they had just wrongfully searched the son of their boss. The older officer cleared his throat, taking a step back. He looked at the boy with wide eyes, now aware of who he was. The younger officer seemed to stumble over his words, trying to apologize but not knowing how to do it without digging himself into a deeper hole. The boy stood there, his mouth dry, still unsure of how to react. The officers, once so sure of themselves, were now visibly uncomfortable. The older officer cleared his throat again and glanced nervously at his partner. "Oh, we didn't know, kid. We didn't know who you were." The younger officer's face turned red, and he quickly added, "We're sorry. We thought you were just, well, we thought you were someone else. This isn't how we didn't mean to." But the boy didn't need to hear their excuses. He could see the fear in their eyes now. They were worried, no doubt about what would happen next, but the boy wasn't feeling sympathy for them. In fact, The more they stammered, the more frustrated he became. It wasn't just that they didn't recognize him. It was that they had treated him like he didn't matter until they realized who his father was. He could feel his pulse racing again, but this time it wasn't just from frustration. The anger was deeper now, a sense of betrayal he couldn't shake. They had assumed the worst about him, simply because of his appearance, and it wasn't until they recognized his last name that their behavior shifted. With a deep breath, the boy spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't care who I was a few minutes ago, but now, suddenly, you recognize me." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "That's what's wrong, isn't it?" The officers remained silent, their heads hung low. They had no response, and the boy could see that their apologies, no matter how sincere they might have been, didn't change what had just happened. This wasn't just about a mistaken identity. This was about how quickly they had judged him, based solely on his appearance. The moment hung in the air like a thick fog. The two officers stood there, almost frozen, their eyes darting from the boy to each other, not knowing what to do next. The realization of what had just happened was starting to settle in, and it was clear that neither officer knew how to fix it. The younger officer shifted uneasily on his feet, his eyes briefly meeting the boy's before looking away. The older officer cleared his throat again, trying to gather his thoughts. I didn't know," the older officer muttered, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. He seemed at a loss, as though struggling to understand how things had gotten so far out of hand. The boy could see the embarrassment written all over the officer's face, but it didn't make him feel any better. It didn't change the fact that they had judged him wrongfully, based solely on their assumptions and prejudice. "Of course you didn't know," the boy replied, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "But it didn't matter, did it? You treated me like I was a criminal from the moment you saw me." He didn't even know why he was still standing there, holding back the anger he felt. He had every right to be upset. It wasn't just the search. It was the way they'd made him feel, like his dignity meant nothing until they realized who his father was. The officers were silent now, their earlier authority now gone, replaced by guilt. The younger officer shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but didn't say anything. He knew that nothing he could say would make up for what had just happened. The older officer, still trying to find the right words, finally took a step forward. His voice was quieter this time, almost apologetic. "Look, kid, we're sorry. We didn't mean to treat you like that," he said, his eyes not quite meeting the boy's. We thought you were someone else. That's all." The boy didn't respond immediately. He took a long breath, staring at the ground for a moment, trying to calm himself. He had every reason to be angry, but he also knew that the situation wasn't going to change just because he shouted at them. The truth was, the officer's apology didn't feel sincere. It felt like they were sorry only because they had realized who he was. If they hadn't recognized his last name, would they have treated him the same way? Would they have apologized then? He didn't think so. "So what happens now?" the boy asked, his voice sharp but controlled. He was still standing there, his hands by his sides, his feet planted firmly on the ground. He wasn't going to back down now. "Are you just going to walk away? Pretend like this never happened?" The older officer seemed taken aback by the question. It was clear that he hadn't thought about what would come next. He exchanged another look with his partner, who seemed just as unsure of how to proceed. After a long pause, the older officer sighed. We'll report it," he said finally, though his words seemed hesitant. "We'll make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The boy didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing. The officers were going to report the incident, but would anything really change? Would their colleagues hold them accountable, or would this just be another case of sweeping it under the rug? He wasn't sure, but he wasn't going to let this moment pass without saying what he needed to say. "You should," the boy said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "Because this isn't just about what happened today. This is about how you see people like me. And that needs to change." The words hung in the air as the officers stood still, looking at the boy with a mixture of guilt and realization. For a brief moment, it seemed like the weight of what had happened was sinking in. The boy knew that it wouldn't be easy for them to change their attitudes, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you could ask for, to make people realize their mistakes, to make them see the world a little differently. After a long silence, the boy turned and began to walk away, his steps slow but purposeful. He didn't look back. He had said what needed to be said. And now, it was time for him to move on. But in the back of his mind, he knew this moment would stay with him. It wasn't just a personal experience. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something that needed to change in the world. The boy walked away slowly, his mind still buzzing with everything that had just happened. His thoughts were all over the place, trying to make sense of the encounter. He couldn't quite shake the feeling of unfairness that lingered like a shadow that wouldn't leave him alone. His steps were steady, but inside, he was anything but calm. He was still processing how quickly everything had escalated from a simple walk home to being treated like a criminal. As he moved further down the street, he could still hear the voices of the officers behind him, but they sounded distant now. The older officer's apology still echoed in his mind, but it didn't feel real. It didn't feel like enough. How could they simply say sorry for something so deep? How could they expect him to just walk away and forget the way they'd made him feel? He was struggling with his own emotions, anger, confusion, frustration, wondering if this was how the world saw him every day. He thought about his father. The realization that the officers had only apologized because they recognized his last name made him angry all over again. He had always been proud of his father's position in the community, of the work his father did to make the world a better place. But now, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, he felt a bitter taste in his mouth. His father's name, the thing that had given him privilege, had also been the only thing that changed the officer's behavior. It wasn't about who he was as a person. It was about who his father was. And that didn't sit right with him. He didn't know how long he had been walking, but when he looked up, he realized he had come quite a distance from where the encounter had happened. The familiar sights of his neighborhood were ahead, and for the first time since it all started, he felt a slight sense of relief. He was almost home, almost in a place where he could take a breath, let go of the tightness in his chest, and let the emotions settle. But even as he got closer to home, he couldn't shake the anger he felt. It was like a heavy weight on his shoulders that he couldn't quite shake off. It wasn't just about the search. It wasn't just about the officers treating him unfairly. It was about the system, about how people like him were treated simply because of how they looked. The boy knew that for him, this wouldn't be the last time. He would face this kind of thing again. He knew there would be others who would judge him before they got to know him. And that thought made him feel small. He wasn't sure how to fight against something so deep-rooted, something so ingrained in the world around him. As he reached his house, the boy's steps slowed. He paused in front of the door for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. His hand rested on the doorknob, but he didn't immediately open it. He wasn't sure if he wanted to talk about what had happened. How would he explain it? How would his family react? He didn't want them to worry, but he also didn't want to keep it bottled up inside. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, he opened the door and stepped inside. The quiet of his house greeted him, but it didn't bring the comfort he had hoped for. He had been looking forward to this moment, to putting everything behind him for the day. But now, standing in his living room, the boy knew that the encounter with the officers wasn't something he could forget easily. It had shaken him, and he wasn't sure how to deal with the emotions it had brought up. He could only hope that, somehow, things would change. That someday, people wouldn't judge him before they knew him. That someday, he wouldn't have to prove his worth based on the color of his skin. But for now, all he could do was sit down and take a deep breath, trying to regain his sense of calm. He knew this wasn't over, but he also knew that he had to keep going, to keep moving forward, even if the world didn't always make it easy. As the boy sat quietly in his living room, the events of the day played over and over in his mind like a broken record. He had barely walked through the door before his thoughts started spinning again. He couldn't shake the feeling of injustice, even now that he was home. The quiet of the house didn't help to calm his mind. If anything, it made it worse. The stillness felt like a contrast to the chaos of his emotions. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes with his palms. He was trying to make sense of everything, but it was difficult. How could the officers just treat him like that? He had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve being searched or questioned in the first place. He kept asking himself if it would have played out the same way if they hadn't recognized his father's name. Would they have let him go? Or would they have kept pushing, kept bullying him, if they hadn't realized who he was? He didn't know the answer, but the thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't fair. As he sat there, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, the door to the living room opened, and his father walked in. His father was a tall man, with a strong presence, someone who had always been there for him. He was the kind of person who others looked up to. The boy's father was well respected in the community, in the police department, and to many people, he was a symbol of authority. But to the boy, he was just his dad, the one person he could count on, no matter what. "Hey, how was your day?" his father asked casually, setting down his briefcase as he came into the room. He smiled, not noticing the tension in the air. The boy hesitated for a moment. Should he say something? Should he tell his dad what had happened with the officers? The boy didn't answer right away. He couldn't bring himself to just tell his father about the encounter like it was no big deal. The anger was still too fresh, and he wasn't sure how his dad would react. He didn't want to worry him, but he also didn't want to hide the truth. He took a deep breath, deciding to just tell him the way it was. "Dad, something happened today." The boy started quietly, his voice a little shaky. His father stopped, his smile fading, as he sat down beside him. "I was stopped by 2 officers on my way home. They searched me, for no reason." His father's face immediately changed. He sat up straighter, his eyes sharp as he listened. "What do you mean they searched you? Just pulled you over on the street?" he asked, his voice suddenly filled with concern. The boy nodded, trying to keep his emotions under control. "Yeah, they said it was routine, but it didn't feel like that. They treated me like I was a criminal. They didn't even explain why they were stopping me." He paused, his fists clenching in frustration. "It wasn't until they saw my last name that they realized who I was. That's when they backed off. They apologized, but it didn't feel real. It didn't feel like they really understood what they had done." The boy's father stayed silent for a moment, his face unreadable as he took in what his son had said. He could see the frustration in his son's eyes, the hurt that he wasn't hiding anymore. It was clear that this wasn't just about the officer's actions. It was about how his son had been treated, how the system had made him feel small, invisible, and less important. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," his father said finally, his voice soft but filled with emotion. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "No one should ever treat you that way. No one. And I'm proud of how you handled it." The boy was silent, his father's words sinking in. He appreciated his dad's support, but it didn't change how he felt. He didn't want to just be proud of how he kept his cool. He wanted things to change. He wanted to live in a world where things like this didn't happen, where he wasn't judged before he even had a chance to speak. "I don't want this to keep happening," the boy said quietly. "I don't want to feel like this every time I leave the house." His voice wavered, but he kept going. "I don't want to be treated like I'm guilty just because of the way I look." His father nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. And I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again. You don't deserve this. No one does." The boy sat back, feeling a little lighter. His father's words meant a lot to him. But even though he felt comforted by his dad's support, The anger was still there, lingering. It was going to take time for him to heal from this experience, to process what had happened. But for now, he felt like he wasn't alone in it. He knew his father would be there for him, helping him through this difficult moment. Together, maybe they could change things. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. The following days felt like a blur for the boy. Everything seemed to move quickly, but his mind kept going back to that moment when the officers had searched him on the street. The frustration was still fresh, and despite his father's support, the incident weighed heavily on him. He had tried to push it to the back of his mind, focusing on school and life at home, but it wasn't easy. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply this experience had shaken him. He kept asking himself if it was a mistake or just part of something bigger. He had always tried to stay optimistic, tried to believe that things could change for the better. But after what had happened, he felt like that belief had been shattered. The realization that he could be judged solely based on his appearance, and that even something as simple as walking home could end with him being treated like a criminal, it was hard to ignore. His father, though, was trying to keep things in perspective. He had promised to look into it, to make sure the officers were held accountable for their actions. He assured his son that he would speak to their department, make sure this kind of treatment didn't happen again. But despite all his father's reassurances, the boy wasn't so sure things would change. He had heard of similar stories before, stories about people being wrongfully judged, about things not really changing. He wanted to believe his dad could make a difference, but there was still that nagging feeling that it wouldn't be enough. One afternoon after school, the boy sat in his room, scrolling through his phone. His thoughts kept drifting back to the incident, and even though he tried to distract himself with homework or social media, it felt like the weight of everything was constantly there. Then, as he checked his messages, he noticed something unexpected. A notification from his father. His father had sent him a text. "I spoke with the officers involved." The message began. "I told them exactly what happened and the impact it had on you. They were receptive, and I've made it clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. I'm also pushing for more training on how to handle situations like this in the future. I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The boy stared at the message for a long time. His father had followed through with what he had promised, and he had taken steps to address the situation. There was a sense of relief in reading those words, but there was also a part of him that wasn't sure it would change anything. He was grateful for his father's efforts, but it was hard to ignore the bigger picture. He still felt that unease, that feeling of being singled out, of being treated as if he didn't matter. But as he read his father's message again, he realized something important. His dad was trying. He wasn't brushing it off or telling him to forget about it. He was doing what he could to make sure this wouldn't be swept under the rug. That meant a lot to the boy, more than he could put into words. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, things could change. It might take time, and it might take more than one conversation, but it was a start. He put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He knew there was still work to be done, that the world wasn't going to change overnight. But for the first time since the incident, he felt a small sense of hope. Maybe things could get better. Maybe his voice could be heard. And maybe, just maybe, people would begin to understand that no one should be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The boy didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. His father, his family, and even the support of others in his community were behind him. That gave him the strength to keep moving forward, to keep pushing for the changes that needed to happen, one step at a time. The next few days were filled with a mix of emotions for the boy. The apology from the officers, though somewhat empty, still lingered in his thoughts. He tried not to dwell on it too much, but there was no denying that it had left a mark. His father had followed through with his promise, and the boy appreciated it, but it didn't completely erase the hurt he felt. He could still picture the way the officers had treated him, the coldness in their eyes as they searched through his things without asking, the way they seemed to disregard his dignity, as if it meant nothing. Despite the heaviness in his heart, the boy started to notice a shift around him. People in the neighborhood were talking. His father's actions had made waves, and even though the boy wasn't entirely sure it would lead to immediate change, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe things could be different. Maybe people were finally starting to understand what it felt like to be judged unfairly, to be seen as less than, simply because of the way they looked. His friends at school started asking him how he was doing, some of them expressing their sympathy and support. The boy hadn't talked much about the incident to anyone, but the simple act of people reaching out made him feel less alone. For the first time in a long time, he realized how important it was to have people who understood and supported him. His friends didn't need to know every detail to understand the hurt he had felt. Just knowing that they were there, that they cared, made a difference. But as the days went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't entirely resolved. Yes, his father had spoken to the officers, and yes, he was pushing for more training and change. But that didn't change the fact that there were still people out there who saw him and others like him as less than. It didn't change the fact that there was still so much work to be done. The boy knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced something like this, and that thought weighed heavily on him. One evening after dinner, the boy sat down with his father. The conversation was casual at first, just talking about their day. But then, the boy brought up the topic again. "Dad," he started, his voice a little softer than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. I know you're doing everything you can, but it doesn't feel like enough. It's like I'm just one person, one story. How do we really change things?" His father looked at him for a long moment, his face thoughtful. He had always been someone who believed in the power of doing the right thing, of standing up for others. But he also knew that change, true change, didn't happen overnight. It took time, effort, and the courage to keep pushing, even when it felt impossible. "Son," his father said gently, "I know it feels like you're just one person, but that's where it starts. One story, one voice. It all matters. You've made a difference by speaking up. You've made a difference just by being honest about how this affected you. And when people hear your story, when they see what happened, it gives them the courage to speak up too. It's not just about one person. It's about everyone coming together. And that's how change happens." The boy listened, taking in his father's words. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that change was possible. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it could happen, and it had to. He wasn't alone in this. His father's support, his friends' understanding, and the community's growing awareness, it all mattered. The boy smiled softly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly how everything would unfold. But he knew he had to keep going. He knew he had to keep speaking up, keep being honest, and keep fighting for the change that needed to happen. Because even if it was hard, even if it felt like nothing was changing, every step forward was still progress. And that, in the end, was enough.